this will totally...
You can sit and I can move.
You can sit, no, we can just do this.
I can move this way. Yeah, just gotta watch. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Lenz, Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy here at the Luskin School, and I want to welcome everyone to our third installment of the Housing, Equity, and Community series. This is the final one of the academic year, but I do want to put in a quick plug. If you do thirst for more of these discussions, I particularly want to highlight an event on Friday, May 18th at the California Endowment in downtown Los Angeles. I will be running a mini conference of sorts on the housing crisis and housing scarcity and affordability issues. And if you're in this room, you've probably gotten an email about it. If not, everybody go run to Maddie afterwards and make sure she knows that you want to attend. There is a cost to that one, but I believe for students in particular, it's affordable. There's 2 meals involved, so it's not just, coming to listen to people talk. There's also some good food and some good conversation. So you'll get fed twice for that money. Today, you get fed once for free. But for that and many other behind-the-scenes details, I want to thank at least 3 institutions and their wonderful colleagues there: the Ziman Center for Real Estate, the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and the Institute for Inequality and Democracy, who are sponsoring and doing a lot of legwork for this event and others. Today's event is centered around a recent report by Professor Paul Ong and his many talented colleagues, including Melanie De La Cruz, who are the 2 folks that are joining me up here today, and I'll introduce them both here. The reports are basically looking at South Los Angeles since the 1960s, and I'll get into why this is a particularly timely topic, and how this evolution or lack thereof, or progress or lack thereof, is an important thing to look at, since particularly that time. But let me get back to Paul, who is a beloved and longtime member of the Luskin School. He's currently officially an emeritus faculty of Urban Planning and Asian American Studies. Emeritus means he's retired, but you see him every day if you're here, so you probably had no idea that he was actually retired. He is still the active director of the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. Paul's research and teaching spans a lot of areas, and his current research agenda focuses on disentangling segregation by income and race, the racial wealth gap, and urban inequality, all topics that I think we'll talk about today. Joining us as well is Melanie De La Cruz. Melanie is a graduate of our master's program in urban planning, so you have to be extra nice to her, not that you wouldn't. And fortunately for this university, we've had the good sense to keep Melanie around UCLA for the last few years. She's the assistant director of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center and the managing editor of AAPI Nexus, which is a nationwide journal focusing on Asian American and Pacific Islander policy, practice, and community issues. She also serves as the director of the AAPI Community Development Census Information Center, which is a joint partnership between AASC, the National Coalition of Asian Pacific American Community Development, and the Census Bureau. She's the lead author of The Color of Wealth in Los Angeles, and she also manages to find time to serve on the City of LA's Human Relations Commission, to which she was appointed by both mayors Villaraigosa and Garcetti. So please welcome Paul and Melanie. Oh, I got more to say.
Oh, okay.
I got more to say. That was just the clap interlude. Okay. Sorry. So why are we talking about South Los Angeles since the 1960s today? I put this report in a larger conversation about racial progress in this country, which is a conversation that is unfortunately, I think, necessary and not particularly positive. there is rightfully a lot of concern right now in this time about our nation's commitment to racial justice, particularly when we have a president who I will describe with extreme charity as racially insensitive. And we have a public discourse that I think can rightfully be described as trading frequently in anti-immigrant xenophobia. But these current forces, political or not, are not fully responsible and maybe are more reflective of the shockingly underwhelming progress made by Black Americans in particular over the last 50 years. For instance, in 1983, the white-black wealth ratio was about 8-1. In 2016, that had grown to 10-1. Some of that you might be able to blame on the Great Recession, but not all of that. And the lack of progress, actually slipping backwards, is, I think, quite damning over such a large time period. Black unemployment rates have been double or more those of whites since the 1950s. There has been only a slight increase in the Black presence in the middle and higher ends of the income distribution. And any gains that we've seen since, say, about 1970 in Black presence in higher income quartiles has a lot to do with the fact that we have often have had poor waves of poor immigrants taking their place. So there's not a lot of progress to report in my reading of the data. I can give you more depressing numbers, but I'll leave that largely to my fellow panelists. But why now? Why look at this right now? So there's a widely known 50th anniversary, of course, this year, that being the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., also 1968 in part due to this tragedy, but a number of events that have been going on for a couple of years before that. Were a number of riots that occurred throughout the country, which really, we can go back to at least the starting point of 1965 with the Watts riots here in Los Angeles. But 1968 serves as the 50th anniversary, in particular, of the Kerner Commission, which was formed by President Johnson to investigate the cause of urban race riots. And for context, in 1967, there were 163 alone. So this was obviously something that was that occupied a large place in the national consciousness on race and other issues. So our discussion today is at a good time to reflect on the progress of the traditional center of Black Los Angeles, which was the setting of not only the Watts riots in 1965, but the riots in 1992 after the Rodney King verdict. It is worth noting that last year was the 25th anniversary of the 1992 riots, and Paul and his team produced a report that you should also check out, looking at South LA since 1992. So I think you should prepare to be at least a little bit outraged. I've read each of these reports on my computer, where I kind of save PDFs, and that's kind of often how I read stuff. And I can't really share my electronic version with people who don't know me very well, or my kids. I do a lot of swearing on my version of these drafts, expressing anger, displeasure, and sadness, and about the lack of progress, which I think is quite stunning and enraging. But as you prepare to be mad, please warmly welcome Melanie, who will walk us through her work with Paul and others on wealth, inequality, housing in South Los Angeles.
Everybody, I just want to quickly thank the organizers and the co-sponsors for the opportunity to present this research. Paul and I also want to thank Andre Comadan, Alicia Chang, Chen Peck, and Celia Gonzalez for their major contributions to this research. As Michael Lenz mentioned, this past March we marked the anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, and it's also 53 years after the Cone Commission report that marked a significant And this marked a significant turning point in America's racialized history, and the Kerner Commission warned that our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The Kerner report also cited that LA's Watts 1965 riots was an omen of violence before the summer of 1967, when 164 documented racial disorders occurred in
there was a new one.
Yeah, right. 128 cities. But I think as we reflect on this anniversary, it gives us pause to think about how far we've come, what worked and didn't work, and what are the implications for the 21st century. These two reports were the first time that federal and state commissions were appointed. And so it's really important to look at how policy and government institutions played a role in reproducing or trying to address racial wealth inequality in the U.S. And so with that, a major focus of the McCone and Kerner Commission reports really focus on affordable housing and subsidizing it, private and nonprofit investors and developers to create this rental housing market. The strategy was to expand the supply over time and have lower rents, but as we've seen, in LA, this strategy really didn't work. And so, we'll get into the data more that talks about that. It also focused on trying to provide equitable access to financial and market interest rate programs in terms of loans, access to loans, and also to provide housing reform codes in terms of reinvesting in neighborhood housing that was substandard, and trying to create programs like Section 8 that would create access to affordable housing. This map in particular is very stark in really showing that the Federal Housing Administration's role in terms of codifying racialized discriminatory practices. This shows South Los Angeles and how it was redlined. And so what you'll see is that the areas in red and yellow basically represent the areas that red being seen as and coded as hazardous, and area C being definitely declining. And so because of these practices that were actually made illegal in 1968 from the Fair Housing Discrimination Act, these practices before that created this systemic structure that didn't allow for a lot of communities of color, especially blacks in South LA, to have the same access to homeownership opportunities. And so when we looked and mapped residential patterns over time, what you'll see too is that in 1960, this is the share of black residents that are largely here on the east side corridor of South LA. And then over time they start to move west, and then you see the Latino population starting to shift over and also reside and make up a larger proportion of South LA. But when you go back and you look at the redlining map, those are the areas that were zoned as hazardous or definitely declining. And so when we think about that 50 years later, what has been the legacy of redlining? It has significant impacts. We look at homeownership and homeownership rates across LA and see how they've fallen over time. But what's really stark is that South LA in comparison never really catches up. In 1960, the homeownership rate was close to 55% for LA County, 41% for South LA. 2015, it's down, for LA County at 46% and South LA at 32%. When we think about race and we look at homeownership by race in South LA, we start out in the 1960s. White homeownership was definitely the highest at 45%. Black homeownership was 36%. That increased slightly in 1990 for Black Americans, but then it decreases in 2015. And then it drops for Latinos in 1990. But then when you look in 2015, still, across all periods, white homeownership is the highest of all the racial groups, while homeownership for blacks and Latinos still lags behind. When we look at median home value rates in LA and South LA, and this is the argument about, how investments and housing equity and how this plays into your wealth building really makes a difference in terms of appreciation of housing equity and home values. And what we see is that, again, over the past 50 years, South LA median home values never reached parity with LA County. In fact, in 2015, the gap was still about 150,000 between LA County and South LA. And I mean, when we're talking about progress, again, when we look at the racialized numbers of median home values in South LA, it's major. I mean, just looking at the 2015 rates alone, the gap between black residents, it's 180,000 compared to white homeowners. And so, and I'm just quickly going over the data, but hopefully this will come much more discussion on what can we do about the closing this gap. Another finding from the research has been that South LA has also been one of the hardest hit in terms of foreclosure rates. Most of the census tracts being concentrated in the top 25% that were hit by foreclosure. And so we're left with the questions, 50 years later, what worked and what didn't work? Again, the Kerner Commission reports, were the first to really document the systematic pattern of severe disadvantage for blacks compared to whites. It looked at the racial practices that existed, and we were able to end legalized housing discrimination through the Fair Housing Act of '68, but by the time that communities of colors were able to enter that housing market in the late 60s, early 70s, the white homeownership, white homeowners were able to benefit more as a means from like GI bills, and that was the point when they also started to see white flight, right? And so I think what we see is that while there was some, practices and legal policies that were able to shift and help communities of color and black homeowners in LA and renters, there's still a lot more work to do. I think in terms of what didn't, the recommendations, we saw that even though redlining was put to end as an end of practices, you still have like predatory lending, right? And that was happening during the 2000s with the foreclosure crisis and the high risky interest rate loans that exacerbated the homeownership gap. And then, the reports missed capturing the racial complexity of LA. As we saw with South LA, the dynamics changed from, being black and white, and then black and Latino, and now we have maybe this return migration where you start to see white millennials coming in. So the complexity that wasn't captured in the reports is something that we have to focus on going forward. And I think finally, while there is a current pattern of investment and development improving housing conditions, and with this is controversial with like the rail lines, there is still that risk that speculative investment has the effect of raising home values with few dividends for existing residents. And how we see this is, the Blackstone group is a private firm that has been buying up foreclosed homes in South LA and turning those into rental units. And so then those homeowners that did have an opportunity to build equity and access over time are now being bought out, and those rental units are replacing homeownership by those residents, and also making things a lot more challenging in terms of housing opportunities in South LA. And you'll see that that's really revealing with the red being some of the major areas where there is a high proportion or concentration of Black-owned investments. And then wanting to close, I think while we're thinking of housing as one of the major assets for addressing racial wealth inequality, it is one of the major forms that people store their wealth. We also need to start thinking beyond housing, and so looking at everything in the person's financial life cycle, from savings at birth, to having a quality education, access to quality jobs with good income structures, having pension and benefits. We really need to think about interventions across a person's lifetime, and think about how they intersect with other challenges like access to health care, student loan debt, and these types of things. And I do want to say that, even though we show that there's not much progress, that there is hope. There are ways to bolster local homeownership without displacement. There's a lot of organizing efforts happening across the federal, state, local level to help the most underprivileged communities to save, build assets, and achieve economic mobility. I work with the California Assets Building Coalition, and they have several bills that they're working on, that they're advocating around, that I'd be happy to share their policy agenda with. Some of our colleagues have been advocating for a federal jobs guarantee program, and they're going to be doing a webinar on Wednesday, May 30th. You can just go to policy link and you'll see their webinars. And this is one way that we're trying to think about closing the housing and wage gap across the nation. And so, I think as long as we stay focused on trying to protect the legislation and policies and programs that help underprivileged communities, and also rethink new policies and develop policies, that we can find ways to really try to solve the housing crisis. So I'll end there.
Here comes Paul.
Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You guys are a fairly lively crowd for having lunch. Thank you for being here. In some ways, talking about these things can be very depressing, but I also think that understanding the nature of the problem helps us be more effective in terms of how to address the issues that we're facing. So in my talk, I'm going to complement the wonderful talk that Melanie gave by talking about trying to unpack the problem of homeownership and try to understand what are the causal factors. I think I'm a believer that knowledge is very useful. Clearly, knowledge by itself is not enough. Knowledge has to be packaged with action and participation in the political arena. But knowledge can help us think about strategies, guide our action. So part of the things that we're trying to do is, again, look at what are the factors here, in this case, that contributes to that ownership gap that's faced by residents of South Los Angeles. And South Los Angeles, I don't know if you realize, it's not a small place. It has a population roughly the size of all of San Francisco, slightly smaller. It's not a small community. It is a huge community. It's also a huge community that faces many challenges. So one of the ways that we're trying to understand the problems that are being faced is represented by this causal model. And so these are four major types of factors that most people think about in terms of contributing to that gap in homeownership. One is economic class. I would say that many of my colleagues believe that economic class explains everything, including the racial gap. But that's an empirical question for me. I'm an empirical researcher. So hypothetically, ethno-racial characteristics, particularly as it becomes transformed in terms of discrimination based on who you are, can also be a separate independent factor. A third one that we're particularly interested in here in urban planning is the role of urban space. That we believe where you reside and also where you work in itself have consequences. And part of that, for example, is around a literature we call place stigma. There's actually a small body of research that tracked the riot areas from the 1960s. And what that shows is that those areas becomes more stigmatized after the riots. And that persists even after you account for other factors that normally explain things such as employment, earnings, homeownership. And clearly there's a bunch of other factors that one looks at: gender, age, composition of household, and so forth. And so essentially we try to look at how these factors, whether they stand alone, and work together in terms of creating the gap in the housing ownership within South Los Angeles. And here is a quick summary of the decomposition of the contribution, and we're focusing really on race, place, and class. And so these are from our multivariate analysis. We're trying to pull apart these effects. That's not easy to do because these things in real world are not independent. And so to a degree that we could rely on certain statistical methods to get an estimate of the contribution. So a couple of things. Indeed, we find that race, class, and place all contributes to the gap in ownership. So it's not just, it's clearly incomes are lower in South Los Angeles, and clearly that contributes to the gap. But that in itself doesn't explain the gap that we see. And there are other factors that affect it, including one's race, and also including where one resides, in this case, residing in South Los Angeles. Those all contribute to the gap between ownership in South Los Angeles and the rest of the county. The other thing is that in all three time periods, these factors are significant and contribute. Although if you look at this, clearly you see changes over time, which tells me that these factors work dynamically over time. The relative importance probably is also affected by the context of the economy at that time, as well as other things such as legal protection or the lack of legal protection. So these are essentially what we call panel analysis. These are snapshots in one point in time. And clearly we picked 3 points in time to represent the time period we're interested in, but didn't work out right. What I want to say is that actually in our other studies is that these, what we call the independent factors, are not themselves independent. And so, for example, differences in income is also driven by different racial differences in the labor market. That is, for example, being African American, being Latino here in Los Angeles also adversely affects your ability to earn. And this is after you control for education, years in the labor market, gender, age, and so forth. And so there is a complexity, since this one doesn't work, there is a complexity over time that these factors act together, that they are linked. And again, we talked about how the labor market is affected by race, but that in turn affects earnings, and that in turn affects your ability to buy a home. Melanie talked about wealth. So our model doesn't have wealth because it's hard to get that data for particularly small regions. But clearly, other studies done nationally and so forth, we know that wealth is a major contributor in terms of your ability to purchase a home. Wealth is also intergenerational. And that, in one period's inequality, gets passed on in terms of other inequality. There's also the complexity, for example, in terms of education as a component of human capital. And that affects the labor market, therefore that affects the housing market. In our study, we looked at the educational achievement of students in elementary school in South Los Angeles relative to the West Side. The gap that was there in the 1960s is still there, and by some measures actually worse. And so what we have is, so I'm going to now try to interpret both this analysis and the broader set analysis, is that there are strong societal forces that perpetuate race, place, and class inequality. That when we talk about what race means, and people want to use the word racism, for example, it actually is a very complex phenomenon. I have come to understand, thanks to many of my colleagues on this campus, to understand what creates racial inequality. Clearly, it's overt discrimination. So if you look in the housing market, for example, there are major cases where landlords have been sued for racial discrimination. One of the most famous was the former owner of the Clipper. Okay, so there clearly is evidence of overt, what I call overt discrimination, but it's sort of not in the style of the 1960s, but certainly it's still there. But there's also implicit biases. That is, we operate in a world where we're not conscious about how we treat people, how we evaluate people. This is closely related to other sort of phenomenon. We economists, for example, like to talk about statistical discrimination. That is, we sort of categorize people by the membership they're in, and we use rough statistical characteristics to impute on that person. Sometimes that's consciously done, but most of us don't do calculation, comparing the means of this group with this means of this group. We sort of have that in our mind in terms of the picture, and that affects our interaction. And there's also institutionalized practices. So what do I mean by institutionalized practices? I mean these are practices that, again, need not be overtly racist. A good example of that is some research I've done with another colleague of mine here, Michael Stoll, where we looked at automobile insurance premiums. And that also is tied to this. If you don't have a car in Los Angeles, you're disadvantaged. Okay, that's the truth. But one of the things is that we have found in our research is that if you take two drivers, identical driving record, identical coverage, identical vehicle, but one lives in a marginalized community, one lives on the west side, the premium for an automobile could be twice as high. Now the insurance company argue it's because it's greater risk in these neighborhoods. And so one of our research was actually got measures of risk, accidents, and so forth, including from the insurance company. Yes, they do explain some of the premium, but actually they don't. The racial neighborhood discrimination does not disappear. That operates separately. And there must be something in terms of institutional practices in insurance companies which always said, we're not guilty. Okay, but there are institutional practices that contributes to this inequality. So again, what we contributes to the racial disparity is overt discrimination, implicit biases, institutionalized practices. And the causality, as I mentioned, is very complex. It's multidimensional. It's intertemporal. It flows across generation. It is, for me, a system of a urban web of inequality. And I think we need to understand that. One of the things that I have always advocated for my department, other department, is that yes, we need to train people in particular areas, in transportation, in housing, in community development, in economic development. But it's also important to understand this as each of your areas is part of a larger phenomenon that we need to understand if we go intervene effectively. And so the research helps us to select areas to intervene. That is, these actions can make a difference. And I have become a true believer that if done right and put into the public discourse, research knowledge can make a difference. And I could give you two quick examples. The research I did with Michael Stowe, for example, became part of the debate, Department of Insurance for California, when they decided to revisit whether they allow insurance company to do what's called geographic premium setting. And they actually said, you could do some of it, but you can't do it at the extent you did because it seems to be out of whack. Another example is work done with Professor Blumenberg, where we looked at the value of a car for those who are transitioning off welfare and trying to find work and hold a job. And our argument was that the past asset limits that was in existence, that came out of Reagan and his sort of stereotyping welfare queens driving Cadillacs. But essentially, particularly in areas such as Los Angeles and probably most metropolitan areas, you have to have a vehicle. And so that led to nationally, a lifting of a higher asset level that one could have, so you could have a reasonable vehicle to get to work, as well as take care of family obligations. Take your children to the doctors for care and so forth. So I am a believer that we can use this research to identify points of intervention and have some impact. But one of the things I've learned is that these problems are like trying to constrain a balloon or squeeze a balloon. If you do it from one point, you squeeze one area and it tends to pop out in another area. And that is one of the things. It's not saying that we can be comprehensive, but it does mean that we need to work with people across silos to come up with answers. So we don't have the problem that you're just squeezing on one part of the problem that ends up popping up somewhere else. And I also believe, unfortunately, that the problem has become worse. It's become worse because we have seen over the last half century, but certainly the last quarter century, a growth in income and wealth inequality. And Professor Lenz mentioned a little bit about that, but this is a national as well as local phenomenon. Here in Los Angeles, the problem is further compounded, particularly in the housing sector, because we face a unique housing market that seems to be constraining both supply overall as well as affordable housing. Oh, where's the rest of my presentation? Oh, there we go. Okay, so, sorry. I just wanted, the last couple of points, the ones about inequality, economic equality, I just want to show with this graph. So this is in constant dollars. This is the distribution of households in Los Angeles as a whole, currently as well as in 1990. And what you see is that there's an expansion on the top end and bottom end, particularly at the bottom end, and you see a contraction in the middle end. That is certainly a national problem. That is a problem in Los Angeles. And there's also, like I said, a compounding problem in terms of our housing dynamics. We talked today, Melanie and I, about homeownership in South Los Angeles, but if you notice her graph, homeownership for the county as a whole has gone down also. But for many low-income people, it's the rental market. And so what has happened to the rental market? The rental market, because I think both constrains the supply, particularly affordable housing, as well as people being forced out of the homeownership market, now competing in the homeownership market, as well as the inequality. So inequality, for example, have driven the production of units at the very high end. I have another slide I didn't put in here, where we looked at construction of new rental units since 2010, and it's heavily disproportionately concentrated on the top end. But what's happening is that the number of units that's affordable, and this is in constant dollar, at the bottom end, has been contracting. Where it's happening, both a combination of new construction as well as what's happening to existing rental units, is that on the average, it's gone up. So you have this compounding problem of income inequality, which is increasing the number of people with low income, but facing higher rent. And the combination of that has created the housing burden crisis. And again, with the Ziman Center support, a couple of years ago, we looked at the increase in the housing burden. We're among the worst in terms of housing burden after you account for income. You know, we're actually worse than the Bay Area. I mean, Bay Area gets attract attention because of the high level. But if you look at it relative to, they have also the income to cover some of that. We're much worse off. So we're facing, in terms of inequality along economic line, along racial ethnic line, along other lines. We're also facing a problem that's being generated nationally and globally. But we also have unique problems here in Los Angeles that we need to address. Again, my approach to things is that we need to try to chip away at it, but also realize it's a much larger problem, and we have to keep our eyes on that larger problem. And I'm very happy you're here because it shows that you do care, and hopefully we could join with you in terms of addressing the problems here in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take I'll use my moderator's prerogative and ask the first couple questions, and then I am happy to open that to you all who've been patiently waiting with lots of interesting insights, I'm sure. So, you know, over recent months, I've been reading your work on this. And, you know, one thing I'm struck by in reading, you know, the Kerner reports and is in addition to your work, both Melanie and Paul, but I'll direct this to Melanie first, you know, is how both an oversupply and undersupply, if you will, of private investment is seen as a major problem, you know, and you know, over decades, we would be talking about an undersupply and neighborhoods that haven't received a lot of attention or investment, public or private. And now there's lots of concerns about, you know, more investment and too much, too fast investment, whether it's public or private. You know, how do we? This is an enormous question, but, you know, how do we square that circle? I mean, how do we get that right? How do we, you know, how do we find that balance in neighborhoods like this?
Well, I mean, I think everybody's seeing that the Blackstone Group is definitely one for concerned. And I think LA also has a great tradition in terms of social and community organizing. And so there's, I think when I was a grad student, I remember Lane was really, Los Angeles for a New Economy was very instrumental in helping to get community benefits agreements in order to preserve a lot of affordable housing units and for new developments in South LA. But it was usually that 80%, 20% ratio, right? 80% market, 20% affordable. Why can't it be 50-50? You know, like, why can't we start to change the formulas with community benefits agreements? I think in terms of making sure that we have affordable housing, but that it really is affordable. And a lot of what I hear too on the ground from grassroots organizers is that the eligibility, for getting into a lot of these homes, affordable homes, also needs to be revisited. For example, a lot of nonprofits working with foster youth and foster families will say, like, it's ridiculous how families that are hosting foster youth will get like $5,000, but the family in the first place only gets $400 to $500 in terms of social welfare benefit support, right? And so, thinking in terms of also, I guess, I don't know, like tax reform. We saw a big hit with the recent administration taking away, claiming dependents. And so how does that going to help low income and middle income families? And I guess I'm thinking more intersectional in terms of when we're trying to address housing and who has access to housing, what are the other factors that play into it? And then making sure that we just preserve policies like the earned income tax credit. So I'm thinking of tax reform as another way to help address housing crisis and issues. So
I think part of the answer is not to look at this at the aggregate, but ask the question, who's not able to invest and who's able to invest? Why the difference? And also what motivates each of these sectors of the society and economy. So clearly we have a strong understanding of who's not able to invest, both because of historical inequality, some structural barriers and so forth. The interesting question, who can invest and why do they invest? And so, if you were in the private market and you're an investor, most of these guys are actually pretty smart. I'm not sure about their ethical and moral compass, but they're pretty smart. And if you understood Los Angeles, for example, over the last 3-4 decades, you could already see signs of increasing rents in real dollar terms. Partly, if you did enough analysis, is because of the gridlock we have in terms of construction. And so, if you have a housing crisis where the price of homes plummeted, you do your analysis, and clearly it's worth investing, buying foreclosure homes. That's what we see. The payoff is high because unless we deal with the gridlock in the housing market, both in terms of construction and affordable units, it's a fixed stock, fixed supply that's not very elastic, and it's going to drive things up. So again, it's sort of a larger understanding of the dynamics that we have here, but also decomposing the question, who's not able to invest, who's investing, and why. Another big actor is the public sector. So we're putting in lots of money for different purposes. One is around sustainable community. That's what driving, for example, putting in more money in transit, in transportation, so forth. And our argument is that it's like any other tool, it's neither positive or negative, it's how you use it. That is, you could make a neighborhood better, you could give people greater accessibility, you could essentially lift up the neighborhood. So long as a public sector, you are responsible not just for putting the money in there and putting the transit station in there, but you assume the consequences of putting it in there. That is, you could change the dynamics of that neighborhood. And therefore, you can't walk away from that. And that's been our argument, is that we need the public sector, which is intervening, to also be responsible for some of these consequences.
So this is a question for either of you. The question of home ownership looms very large in the Kerner report, in the work that you've done, and it occupies, I think, a large space in the conversation about wealth inequality, which is certainly an enormous issue in racial disparity in this country. I I worry, particularly in Los Angeles, that to some respects the ship has kind of sailed on the days where you can, be a not wealthy individual or a middle class or even lower middle class individual and buy a starter home and see wealth gains over time. I think if I don't know the exact numbers in various neighborhoods within South Los Angeles, but I imagine something like $400,000 doesn't really even get you all that much, right? So how do we, so should we be pushing still the idea of home ownership as this great wealth building enterprise? How would we even get there with those kind of prices?
I think you have actually a very good point. If you analyze it, why ask people, particularly disadvantaged people who face racial and class barriers, why take a risk and put your life saving in there to only see a high odd of having evaporate? It's just the next housing crisis or the next job loss. So you're asking people to take this risk that statistically we know is stacked against you. And in that sense, it makes no sense. So it should be a public policy. Maybe we should pay our attention elsewhere. But you can think about it a different way, which is a larger question of equality in society, our membership in society, our citizenship in society. For example, if you happen to be in the minority among voters, and you cannot elect a person who shares your value. So is the answer you give up on that? You give up your right to vote because you're not going to win, at least for the next election, an election after that? My answer is that, again, both in terms of voting and in terms of home ownership, in our society, both of those things represent full membership in our society. So fighting for both is something I think is worthwhile doing beyond the calculus about, what does it gain you? And clearly, it can't be just done by the individual, either at the ballot place or in the housing market. Mm-hmm. We need to think about a broader movement to guarantee these as rights.
Yeah, I think it's really complex because I get the question of whether you also want to set down roots in a place is very important. I mean, some of the work we've done using the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color survey has showed that in terms of net wealth, Asian Indians in LA actually had they occupied the second highest net wealth, but mm-hmm. they had the lowest home ownership rate. Mm-hmm. And amongst the groups that we looked at, and it was largely because most of their wealth was, it was driven by having high incomes and also stocks and dividends and investments. And so, so I think it also depends on how you enter, the economic market.
Yeah, agreed. All right, I don't want to steal all the questions here. I open it up to the floor. Let's hear it. Sir in the back.
I moved to South Central 30 years ago. I don't know how many here live in South Central. The 2010 census was a crock. My zip code was showed as a 3% vacancy rate. The vacancy rate right where I live in my zip code is 30%. So when you put numbers in that are garbage, you get garbage out. My issue is that in 1994, second trust deeds could foreclose on a house in 90 days. My neighbors get hauled to rest homes and they roll their houses. And the reason is, take my neighbor for example, immediately on my south. She has a 2-bedroom, single bath house. It's gorgeous with a front lawn and a back lawn. And she pays $800 a year to live there, not counting utilities. At some point, and my grandfather moved to this state in the 1870s, it didn't become profitable for the counties to not roll these houses, and they have to roll. At one point we were rolling most homes in the LA basin every 5 years in order to kill Proposition 13. Those are the issues that South Central is faced with. The market is BS. There's no market in South Central. It's totally contrived. There's a wonderful article.
I love the data. Is there a question?
How many people live in South Central? Good to see you, sir. Meetinghouse.Tokyo, you'll find me.
Thank you. Yes.
So I have a couple of comments. This is on Melanie's presentation. On your foreclosure rate, it says at the bottom, the source of the data was DataQuick 2007 to 9.
Yes,
So that data is almost 9 years
true.
out. And most of the foreclosures occurred really in the period 10, 11, and then 12. So that, I think that should be updated to really reflect what went on. But another
It's
comment, you
arguable.
talked about corporate ownership in South LA, and you pointed out Blackstone had maybe 20,000 units, I think,
More or
in
less.
South LA, something like that. I have nothing to do with Blackstone. I don't know anybody there. But everybody has to remember, we were in a death spiral. And the worst, it's been characterized as the worst depression since the Great Depression. We were in a death spiral for foreclosures. And it was only because guys like Blackstone and a few other large groups went in and bought those properties by the thousands that stopped the values from going even further south and there being even more foreclosures. And did they make money from it? Sure they did. And Paul mentioned that it was almost a sure thing for them. But remember, at the time, these guys were risking their capital too, and nobody knew how far this thing was going to go down. And had they not stepped in, it would have been worse.
I think a couple of things. One is we can provide you a link. We actually tracked the foreclosure over a broader 7 years. What was shown there is the highest rates. So actually, I'm not sure how we would get that, but we have tracked over many more years than what we showed up in the presentation. In some ways you're right, in some ways you may not have the full picture. So people do buy low, and the question is who buy low? Did Blackstone step in? Actually, it's not easy to find Blackstone because Blackstone does not operate as Blackstone here in Los Angeles, and we're not even sure if the data is complete because they operate under so many different LLCs. One of the problems is we tend to look at phenomena in a confined way. So I would agree with your interpretation, though I'm not sure how dramatic the market would have dropped more, right? Because there's actually lots of local players too, so it was just not Wall Street money. And at some point, if it dropped far enough, even the residents there could afford it. So maybe it would have been better to let it drop. Those are all hypotheticals. So, but I don't dispute that they did step in. They did sort of slow the decline and so forth. But what I'm trying to argue, particularly in my last set of slides, is that we need to understand this in a broader set of factors and a longer time period. There's also the question, for example, why did so many subprime and risky loans were concentrated in these neighborhoods? It can't be, our analysis, it can't be just explained by differences in income or even factor in things like your credit score and so forth. There are other factors that put people at risk. So my point is that we need to understand this not as low slices of the phenomena, but understand that there's a larger urban structure that contextualizes it, that operates across time. And so should we make Blackstone a villain? It has political leverage, sort of sexy and catchy. But beyond that, I think the point is that there is a larger set of practices that are institutionalized, that systematically for different reasons, disadvantage certain populations in certain neighborhoods, certain communities. And we can't tackle, from my point of view, which I think is a pressing problem in our democracy, you can't have democracy, in my point of view, if we keep on this trajectory of inequality and marginalizing people. So, good point, but I also encourage broad thinking.
Can I add something to that?
Let me go to the back row first, please.
I love that you touched on the fact that identity plays a part in this, and where do you think the responsibility is? Is it with the neighborhoods that are affected themselves or the larger public discourse that currently doesn't have that as part of the conversation? Where do we start to tackle identity as it plays into conditions?
I mean, I think very much of it is structural inequality caused by these codified racial practices, and so we really need to start there, looking at the systemic barriers that that cause these inequalities to exist. And so, going back to the predatory lending practices that happened that Paul was talking about, making sure that there is protections in place so that that prevents further predatory practices on these communities. And so, again, the California Asset Building Coalition has a homeowner bill of rights that they're pushing forward. We used to have the Consumer Protection Bureau at the national level, but now that's slowly being dismantled. There's just a lot of these rollbacks that are happening that we need to fight for and make sure that they continue on to make sure that policies, programs, and services continue to be equitable.
I think one of the things that we really need to think about is how do we build bridges across different populations.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we sometimes get into too much of a politic of who's authentic, who has the right to address these problems. The problems, in my perspective, is so massive if we don't have broad coalitions to move the agenda along. You're not going to move the agenda along. That means having people from those communities. It means having people outside those communities. It means having activists. It also means having scholars involved. And so I do fully appreciate the role of direct experience in anchoring these problems. I know these problems personally. When my parents tried to look for a home, they were told that they cannot buy in any neighborhoods except for one or two in Sacramento. I grew up in an African American community. So, in a sense, we need to understand that those experiences matter and they shape who we are and they give us a certain voice from our experience.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not enough. We're facing, I think, a critical juncture in our history, in our society, about who we are, what we're committed to, and what we're willing to do. And I am really hopeful that we would have a broad coalition of people who share broad values. I mean, we could differ on particular strategies, as, for example, the debate around SB 827.
You're not supposed to say those words.
But I hope that there are many people who may disagree on that, but are still united by a fundamental concern about how we deal with inequality. We need to have a discussion and talk to each other. But again, let's think about broader coalitions.
Yes, exactly. Yep, back by the door.
So LA is inherently a very difficult place to build. From a policy perspective, where do you see ways to sort of streamline that process to incentivize development?
Oh, I don't answer questions up here. Well, I think. I still. Post SBA 27, you weren't supposed to utter those words. Well, we didn't have a contract. I still think that that local power has gotten us into over land use has gotten into us a lot of trouble, both from a segregation standpoint and from a housing affordability standpoint. Right now, I think. Well, and also to learn more, come to the California Endowment somewhere around 8:30 to 1 on May 18th.
And you get a discount.
and contact me and or Maddie for a discount. I think first of all, the city of Los Angeles in particular would say that they're doing a lot of great things to move the ball forward on increasing more development in more places and making more and more of that development more often affordable, so we don't see some of the crazy rent graphs that Paul ended his presentation with. But apologies to anyone who's working in the current administration here in Los Angeles. They've been there for quite a while, and we are in a pretty bad situation right now. So I think, to me, there does need to be a continued conversation about how we pull some of the land use powers out of local government hands. And how do we do that while building up the power of lower income and more traditionally disadvantaged communities, while maybe reducing or limiting the power of those that are not, I think is a really difficult circle to square. But that's kind of the direction I think we need to move our land use conversation in order to get more widespread, equitable housing supply, and which will hopefully cool off the affordability problem. No more questions from me. Just kidding, Tim.
Did you guys look at maybe FHA programs and if that was at all effective in promoting homeownership in that area or anywhere?
Do you mean Section 202 or Section 8 or what?
It could be any of those programs or since we're talking about homeownership, the mortgage programs in particular.
Right.
No, we didn't.
Or the Community Reinvestment Act or stuff like that.
Yeah, no. But I think there's two issues. One is what we call the affordable housing agenda, and I am in agreement with it, although it also creates horizontal inequality that we can't get away from. I mean, we just are not putting enough resources to get away from what we call horizontal inequality. That is, two households, low income, one in the program, one not in the program.
Right.
So that's the issue. The other one is that how do we have a broader policy and an economy that's supportive of it? So quite often we concentrate on the policies in particular, and rightfully so. But we also have to have an economy or a housing market that is supportive, so the problem is not as bad. Policies that really